I only needed shelter. But that Teasel drawer remembered my grandmother.
Sua Part 1. The Exile and Hook. She was 21 and homeless. No room, no family tool, no place to return to, just a wool shawl, one bent carding hook, and $4 she had saved from washing cafe pans. And with that $4, she bought a forgotten wool carding comb workshop near Harrisville, Cheshire County, New Hampshire. Absent from county maps since 1949, the north roof had opened above the rafters. One fieldstone wall leaned toward the creek. The county condemned it on October 18, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring thaw. Yet beneath the comb-setting bench waited a sealed Teasel drawer, unopened for 73 years, holding money, a ledger, and the reason women had once survived winter there. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Eliza Morrow had been carding her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she drew burrs from sheep wool at the kitchen table, while rain ticked against the glass. She believed every household kept a wooden paddle beside the flour bin, and that all grandmothers could separate a fleece by touch, saving the long shoulder fibers for thread and the coarse breech wool for stuffing. Only later did she understand that most children did not fall asleep to the small, dry music of wire teeth passing through wool. Her father, Daniel, had driven a snowplow for the town of Keene and carried winter in the cracks of his hands. He died when Eliza was 9, after a truck crossed the center line on Route 12. Her mother, Marlene, became quieter afterward, not cruel, but easily governed by whoever spoke with certainty. The certainty in Eliza's childhood belonged to her grandmother, Ruth Morrow, who lived in a narrow white house outside Marlborough. Every Saturday, Ruth tied on a brown ticking apron and set a washed fleece across 2 cane chairs. She taught Eliza to open locks from the tips, never the cut ends, then load each carding paddle lightly so the teeth could work without bending. The handles were maple, darkened by lanolin and years of palms. When a tooth loosened, Ruth warmed hide glue in a baby food jar, pressed the wire into its drilled hole with a setting hook, and checked the row against a steel rule. At noon they ate boiled eggs and rye bread. By 3, pale rolls of prepared wool lay in a willow basket, aligned like quiet clouds waiting for the wheel. Never punish the fiber for being tangled, Ruth once told her. Find where it yields. Eliza understood years later that her grandmother had not been speaking only of wool. Ruth died in February 2019, during a week when the snowbank stood higher than the mailbox. Her spinning wheel, hand cards, comb-setting vise, and blue ledger passed to Marlene, who stored them in the spare room. Within a year, Eliza's stepbrother, Wade, had moved in. The vise disappeared first, then the cards. He said old tools were worth more sold than remembered. Marlene watched each empty space gather dust. Wade never shouted when a lower voice would do. He kept household bills beneath a ceramic rooster and made Marlene ask for grocery money from the envelope. He checked the mileage on her car, counted the cans in the pantry, and called Eliza's sewing repairs a hobby whenever someone paid her. The evening he sold Ruth's wheel to clear a gambling debt, he polished the table where it had stood. The clean circle in the dust seemed more deliberate than an insult. On November 3, 2022, Eliza returned from the diner and found her belongings in a green laundry basket on the porch. Ruth's shawl lay on top, folded around one bent carding hook. Wade stood behind the screen door, one hand on the latch. Marlene remained in the hall, twisting a dish towel around her finger. "You cannot stay here after tonight, Eliza." "Leave." 8 words. The porch bulb hummed. Eliza waited for her mother to move toward the door. Marlene lowered her eyes and polished the same dry plate. When Eliza lifted the basket, its cracked handle split, scattering her clothes across the wet boards. Wade did not move. She gathered everything into Ruth's shawl, tied the corners, and walked toward Main Street, with the hook tapping her hip. For 6 weeks, she moved through towns that offered light, but no place to remain. In Keene, she slept behind a laundromat boiler vent, where lint drifted against the bricks. In Peterborough, she spent $7 on soup and a bus seat, then slept in an office stairwell until a cleaner arrived at 5. Nashua took $23 for a shelter cot and locker fees. In Manchester, she rested beneath a parking garage overhang, waking when tires hissed through rain above. Her money fell from $41 to $26, then $11. She washed in library restrooms, mended a waitress's apron for breakfast, and learned which church vestibules were open until evening. By mid-December, 4 $1 bills were pressed inside Ruth's recipe envelope. The advertisement found her at the Harrisville Public Library, where she had gone to escape sleet. It hung beside notices for piano lessons and chimney sweeping. Cheshire County Tax Disposal, Structure and Lot, $4, Cash Deed. Below it, Wool Carding Comb Workshop, uninhabitable, no utilities, demolition pending. A pencil map placed it beyond Hancock Road. She read it 3 times. The copied survey showed less than an acre, a legal address, a spring right, and taxes already forgiven. $4 would leave nothing. It would also buy a door no one else could close against her. Before closing, Eliza copied the bus schedule onto the advertisement and wrapped her money inside it. Outside, sleet struck the pavement like seed. She turned toward the station with everything she owned beneath Ruth's shawl. By morning, she would stand before the county clerk and ask to buy what the county had already decided to erase. Thus, Caillou, Tara, LOI, 2DA, Dan Markdown. 1. Sua, Part 2. The Arrival. The bus left Manchester before daylight, its heater breathing warm dust across Eliza's boots as it moved west through sleet. She rode as far as Peterborough, then spent $1.75 on a day-old biscuit before walking north, with Ruth's shawl pinned beneath her chin. The road climbed steadily, edged by stone walls and white pines bowed under ice. By afternoon, she had covered nearly 11 miles. Darkness found her beside a hay barn off Route 137, where she crawled through a loose siding board and slept between square bales, while the temperature fell to 19 degrees. Hay scratched her cheek. Mice worked somewhere below. She woke twice to stamp feeling back into her feet. The next morning was clear enough to hurt her eyes. She walked another 9 miles, following the narrow road toward Harrisville, while chimney smoke lifted straight above the trees. The village appeared around a bend without announcement. The brick mill beside the frozen water. The Harrisville General Store, with its porch swept clean. Aldworth Manor's sign farther up the hill. The post office beneath a white cupola. The Harrisville Inn with lace curtains in its front windows, and a small cafe called the Spindle Room, where someone was turning chairs down from the tables. 5 places with doors. 5 places that seemed to know who belonged inside them. Eliza crossed the road before she could begin counting the money she no longer had. The county clerk's office occupied the first floor of a granite building in Keene, and reaching it required another bus ride paid for by cleaning the cafe's back steps and carrying 2 coal buckets to the cellar. By 10:30, she stood beneath fluorescent lights with melting snow darkening the shoulders of her coat. A woman behind the counter wore silver hair cut square at the jaw and a narrow red cord around her glasses. The brass plate before her read, Miriam Bell, Deputy Clerk. She examined the damp advertisement, then looked over its edge at Eliza. You understand the structure has been condemned? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no electricity, plumbing, or legal occupancy certificate? Yes, ma'am. You understand the roof may fail without warning? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not refund the purchase price or remove debris. Yes, ma'am. Miriam held Eliza's gaze for several seconds, perhaps waiting for hesitation to arrive. When it did not, she opened a gray deed book and placed a single-page quitclaim form on the counter. Full legal name, Eliza Ruth Morrow. The clerk's pen stopped above the paper. Morrow, she repeated. Your people from Marlborough? My grandmother was. Ruth Morrow. Miriam removed her glasses and let them hang against her blouse. The sharpness in her face changed, not softening exactly, but making room for something older. Ruth used to come here every October, she said. Brought wool blankets for the winter relief closet. Never left her name on them. Eliza touched the bent carding hook through the cloth of her pocket. She taught me to prepare fleece. She learned in Harrisville. Miriam turned toward a row of county ledgers and drew out a volume bound in green canvas. After several pages, she placed one finger beneath an entry, dated 1971. Ruth Ellen Morrow, apprentice carter, Wren Comb Works. I remember her carrying 2 paddles through town. She was 17 or 18. Walked as if those tools were books from a church. Eliza read the line without touching it. Her grandmother had spoken of mills, of water wheels, of wool brought in burlap sacks, but never of this place. Ruth had taught the work as though it had begun at the kitchen table and belonged nowhere else. Miriam closed the ledger carefully. The building in your notice is what remains of Wren Comb Works. The brass stamp came down on the deed with a clean, mechanical crack. Miriam pressed a county seal into the lower corner, accepted the 4 worn dollar bills, and slid the document beneath a blotter. Take Hancock Road, east from the village, she said. Past the cemetery, then the old mill race. At the split, keep left where the plow turns around. You will see 2 black walnut trees and a leaning stone wall. The workshop is behind them. She folded the deed into a heavy cream envelope. Before handing it over, she opened the shallow drawer at her right knee and placed one of Eliza's dollar bills flat inside, rather than with the day's receipts. For the record, Miriam said, when Eliza noticed, the county received payment in full. By early afternoon, Eliza was walking Hancock Road. Sunlight broke through the clouds and flashed on the snowmelt running beneath the ice. Near the cemetery, an elderly man in a brown canvas coat was cutting brush along his fence. A red setter stood beside him, holding one front paw above the cold ground. You headed for the Wren place? The man called. Eliza nodded. The dog gave one low bark. Name's Amos Pike. That's Cricket. She distrusts parcels and umbrellas, but not people. He rested both hands on his pruning saw. Road quits being a road past my mailbox. Mind the washout. Eliza thanked him and continued. Cricket followed for 40 yards before Amos whistled her back. The walnut trees appeared first, their bare crowns crossing above the lane. Behind them stood a long timber workshop, approximately 48 feet by 22, with a fieldstone foundation and clapboards weathered nearly silver. A strip of the north roof had collapsed between 2 rafters. The brick chimney leaned outward by several inches, its top courses blackened and loose. Above the double doors hung a wooden sign whose remaining letters could be read only from an angle. Wren Comb Works. Setting and repair. One door resisted until Eliza lifted it by the iron latch and pushed with her shoulder. The bottom scraped across the floor, releasing a smell of damp wood, mouse nests, cold ashes, and the sweet animal heaviness of lanolin. Light entered through cracked panes in narrow bars. Dust moved inside them. The front room held a counter, 3 wall racks, and a small cast-iron stove streaked with rust. When Eliza stepped forward, a plank answered with a long complaint beneath her left heel. Another board felt firm, she began learning the floor, 1 foot at a time. Beyond a partition lay the workroom. The air there was colder, carrying the mineral scent of stone and old iron. Her fingers brushed a bench, polished smooth, where generations of wrists had rested. Fine wool still clung beneath its edge, gray locks mixed with brown and cream. Along the wall stood wooden comb paddles without teeth, a hand drill, and shallow drawers labeled in faded pencil. Teasels, wire, handles. She pulled the teasel drawer. It moved less than an inch before stopping. Something inside shifted with a dense, muffled sound. Eliza released it. Not yet. Water dripped in the rear corner, each drop striking a metal pan someone had left decades before. She tasted rust when she licked snow from her glove. A draft passed through the broken roof and touched the sweat, cooling at the back of her neck. Somewhere in the rafters, a chickadee scratched against dry wood and flew out through a gap. Before dark, she swept a rectangle of floor beside the stove, spread Ruth's shawl over her clothes, and placed the deed inside her coat. The boards were hard beneath her hip. Cold entered from below with patient certainty. Yet when the wind pushed against the doors, they held. She lay awake, listening to the creak under its cover of ice, the building settling around her in small wooden notes. For the first time in 6 weeks, every sound beyond the walls belonged outside. What had been kept was still waiting for careful hands. Kao Tra Loi, 3 Tiep Tuk Fois, Part 3. The Discovery. Gyu Dung Nip Ke. Qui Trin Kam Pa Va Kak Chi Tiet Ki Thuat Trong Tep. Dadan Markdown. 1 Sua, Part 3. The Discovery. By sunrise, Eliza was moving. The first 3 days taught her what the property would permit and what it would not. A stone-lined well stood 70 paces behind the workshop, its wooden cover split, but its water clear after she lowered a tin cup on baling twine. The outhouse leaned downhill beyond the walnuts, though one wall remained sound enough to brace with 2 salvaged boards. Indoors, she learned that the 3rd plank from the front door gave a sharp crack. The boards beside the stove groaned softly, and the workroom floor fell silent near the north wall, where frost had tightened the joists beneath it. On the 4th morning, she walked into Harrisville, carrying the bent hook and a list written on the back of the demolition notice. The hardware store occupied a narrow brick building near the mill pond. Inside, burlap sacks rested beneath shelves of bolts and lamp chimneys, and the air held the warm metallic smell of nails measured from wooden bins. The owner, Silas Avery, had 1 white eyebrow and 1 brown, which gave him the permanent expression of a man questioning his own prices. "You are the young woman at Wren Comb Works," he said. Eliza placed her list on the counter. "I need enough to make the chimney safe." Silas read each line, then looked through the front window toward the frozen pond. "Safe and warm are separate accounts." "I know. Cash? Not yet." He rubbed the white eyebrow with his thumb. "I keep a 30-day book for people whose roofs I can see from town." "Yours? I cannot." Eliza began folding the list. "But Miriam Bell called yesterday," he continued. "Said Ruth Morrow's granddaughter bought the place. Ruth paid every account before I learned long division." He drew a ruled ledger from beneath the counter. "You get $15 credit. No tobacco, sweets, or foolish paint colors." "Yes, sir. And take this." He pushed a stained booklet across the wood. Its cover read, "Repairs for Farm and Shop, 1948 edition. Free if you promise not to follow the electrical chapter." Eliza signed to the account. She bought a 5-inch wire chimney brush for $3.40, 20 feet of rope for $1.10, a tin of stove cement for $1.85, 2 pounds of cut nails for $1.25, a galvanized stovepipe elbow for $2.60, and a box of wooden matches for 12 cents. Silas added a used ash shovel without writing it down. Back at the workshop, she tied the brush rope to a wrench and threw it across the roof ridge from the safer southern slope. The first throw struck a rafter, the second slid into snow. On the fifth attempt, the wrench passed over the chimney and dropped within reach on the far side. She climbed only as high as the roof remained whole, bracing her boots against cedar shingles, softened by rot. After removing 3 loose chimney bricks by hand, she lowered the wire brush into the flue. It stopped 4 feet down. Eliza pulled upward, twisted the rope, and let the brush fall again. Black flakes whispered into the firebox below. On the 7th stroke, a sheet of creosote broke loose with the sound of a dinner plate shattering. The rope jerked through her gloves, leaving a burn across one palm. She worked from 9 in the morning until nearly 4, climbing down every hour to shovel the soot into a flour sack. The lowest obstruction was a compacted nest of twigs, wool, and gray feathers wedged above the stove collar. She loosened it with a straight length of wire and caught the debris in an iron pan. By the time the brush passed from chimney top to firebox without resistance, her face and sleeves were black. She sealed 2 hairline stove cracks with cement, replaced the crushed elbow, and waited until the following afternoon before testing the draft. A twist of newspaper burned first. The flame leaned toward the pipe. Eliza added pine splinters, then 1 piece of dry maple. Amos Pike had left beside the door without a note. Smoke lifted cleanly through the flue. The stove began making small iron sounds as it warmed. For her first hot meal, she boiled well water in a dented kettle and stirred oats with half an apple. Doris from the cafe had placed in her coat pocket. Steam clouded the nearest pane. Eliza sat on the floor, holding the bowl with both hands, while heat reached no farther than the front room and still felt sufficient. That afternoon, she began recording the contents of the workroom in Ruth's old manner. Useful, repairable, uncertain. She found 6 unfinished maple paddles, their handles shaped but their faces unpierced. A comb-setting vise remained bolted to the main bench, its screw stiff beneath hardened grease. 3 coils of blued wire hung from a peg, each wrapped in oilcloth. A shallow copper warming tray held a crust of ancient hide glue. There was a steel tooth gauge marked in 30/2 of an inch, a draw-testing frame with 1 missing clamp, and a covered basket containing teasel heads gone brittle, but still armed with their hooked bracts. Beneath the bench stood 7 drawers. The first contained awls. The second held drill bits nested in wool. The third was filled with handle wedges and 2 mouse skeletons as fine as carved ivory. The Teasel drawer remained stuck. Eliza knelt and examined the runners. Its face was oak, unlike the pine fronts above it. When she tapped the left side with Ruth's bent hook, the wood answered lightly. The center gave a shorter sound. At the right corner, the tap became dense and without echo. She emptied the Teasel heads through the narrow opening, drawing them out one by one with kitchen tongs borrowed from the cafe. The drawer was deeper outside than inside by nearly 3 inches. Eliza tested its weight by lifting from beneath. It was far heavier than an empty oak box should have been. Along the rear panel, she found 4 wooden pegs disguised beneath brown wax. She warmed the hook over the stove, pressed its curve against each plug, and turned slowly until the wax softened. 3 pegs pulled free. The 4th broke below the surface. For nearly an hour, she worked around it with an awl, refusing to pry against the old grain. At last, the rear panel shifted forward, the width of a fingernail. Behind it rested a cedar disc fitted into a circular recess. The disc bore no writing, only a shallow mark shaped like 2 crossing carding paddles. Eliza pressed the center. Nothing moved. She rotated it clockwise. The disc stopped after half a turn and rose against her palm on a hidden wooden thread. Cold cedar scent entered the room. She set the disc on the bench. Inside the false depth were 5 packages wrapped separately in waxed cloth. She lifted them in order and placed each one beneath the window, where the afternoon light was strongest. The first bundle contained Ruth's comb-setting vice key, or one identical to it, its walnut handle worn flat along one side. Beside it lay 2 wire punches, a curved tooth lifter, and a narrow oilstone darkened by years of use. The second held raw materials, short coils of tempered steel wire, thin maple blanks, linen thread, and 3 packets of powdered hide glue labeled by strength. Each packet had been folded and tied, not sealed. The third package was a pair of hand cards, smaller than Ruth's, with cherrywood backs and rows of wire teeth aligned so evenly that Eliza passed her thumb above them without touching. On the underside of one handle, the initials RM had been cut with a knife. She sat down. The initials were not proof of anything. Ruth had not been the only person with those letters. Still, Eliza laid the cards across her knees as her grandmother once had, handles pointing inward, and noticed a repaired tooth near the upper corner. The replacement wire leaned perhaps 1 degree to the left. Ruth's first repair had leaned that way. Eliza wrapped the cards again before opening the 4th parcel. It contained a work ledger bound in black cloth. Water had marked the lower edge, but the pages remained intact. The first entries listed comb repairs, prepared fleeces, pounds of wool, and small payments in cents. Later pages included women's names beside the words "no charge," "winter account," or "pay" after yarn sold. She did not read farther. The final package was a rectangular tin box tied with faded blue tape. A sealed envelope lay on top, addressed in dark brown ink. "My dear one, whoever you are." Eliza placed the letter beside the ledger and did not open it. The tin lid resisted at 2 corners. She eased a knife under the rim, lifted one edge, then the other. Inside, currency lay in papers, brittle with age. Beneath it were cloth rolls that made a low, unmistakable sound when moved. Coins. She carried the box to the front room and closed both doors. The stove had burned down to coals. Evening gathered against the windows while she counted on the swept floor. There were United States silver dollars, most dated between 1878 and 1923. 50-cent pieces bearing walking liberty, silver quarters, and rolls of Indian head and early Lincoln cents. The paper money included old 10s and 20s, alongside newer bills placed there decades later. She counted once by denomination, again by bundle, and a third time from the beginning. The total was $33,240. At the bottom of the box lay a bronze purple heart in a cracked presentation case. The reverse bore a name and the year 1944 Thomas Wren. Eliza touched only the edge of the case. Outside, darkness had settled over the creek. She returned the money to the tin, placed the metal above it, and wrapped the ledger in Ruth's shawl. The unopened letter remained on the bench, its paper yellow beneath the lamplight. She could not read it while surrounded by walls. Eliza stepped through the back door and followed the sound of water. Ice covered the creek, except where the current pressed darkly between stones. She stood beneath the walnut trees until the cold reached through her coat, watching water carry fragments of moonlight downstream. Behind her, the workshop windows held a weak amber glow. What had been kept was still waiting for careful hands. Cow Tra, LOI, 4 Sua, Part 4. The Letter. Morning entered through the eastern windows in a narrow gray band. Eliza fed 2 maple sticks into the stove, warmed her hands above the iron lid, and carried the envelope to the comb-setting bench. The handwriting troubled her before she understood why. The capital M opened with the same deep first stroke Ruth had used on birthday cards, and each final letter leaned slightly upward, as though the writer had refused to let a sentence fall. She broke the seal with the thin edge of the tooth gauge. "My dear one, Whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the cedar wheel still turns, and someone patient enough to notice false depth has entered the shop. My name is Margaret Ruth Wren. In March of 1948, Dr. Samuel Pierce, at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, told me the illness in my blood would not be cured. He gave me months. I have taken nearly a year, which feels less like a victory than borrowed daylight, and I am using some of it to leave the work in order. The first comb maker here was Eliza Wren, born in Dublin, New Hampshire, in 1818. He settled beside this creek in 1846 and taught the trade to his daughter Abigail, born here in 1851. Abigail's son Nathaniel carried the shop through the mill years and married Clara Bell of Hancock in 1887. Their daughter was my mother, Ruth Abigail Wren, born in 1892, who taught me to set wire when I was 12. I was born in this house in 1903. 4 generations, 1 bench, and more winter wool than any ledger can honestly remember. My husband, Thomas, was killed in France in September 1944 while serving with the United States Army. The Purple Heart in the tin came home without him. Our only son died of scarlet fever at 6. After that, I kept working because the paddles still needed teeth, and because women arrived with fleece beneath their arms and children waiting at home. The trade closed on October 2nd, 1948. There were no orders left large enough to pay for wire, and the mills had begun buying machine-made cards from farther south. More than 30 years may pass before anyone opens this drawer. It may be far longer. These instructions are for the person who chooses work over selling what remains. Warm hide glue to no more than 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Hotter glue weakens after it dries. For handle oil, mix 2 parts boiled linseed oil with 1 part turpentine and wipe away every trace after 20 minutes. Set the outer wire rows first, then work inward, checking every 6th tooth against the steel rule. When testing a comb, draw 1 ounce of clean fleece through it 3 times. If the fibers tear, the teeth are too sharp, or the rows too close, the money was gathered slowly. Some came from my father. Some came from women who repaid winter accounts years after I had forgotten them. Keep what is necessary to make the building sound. Do not mistake preservation for worship. A tool earns its place by being used, repaired, or passed to someone who will use it. The ledger matters more than the coins. You will find names marked "No Charge." Those women sold yarn, mittens, blankets, and stockings when wages stopped or husbands did not return. The shop did not rescue them. It prepared wool. They did the rescuing themselves. Inheritance is not possession. It is accepting unfinished work without pretending you began it. Keep your rows exact. Oil the handles. Do not tear good fiber through impatience. Leave 1 useful thing ready for a stranger. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Margaret Ruth Wren, January 14th, 1949. Eliza read the letter twice. The second time, she moved her finger beneath each line, stopping at the words Ruth Abigail Wren. Her grandmother had carried the name Ruth, the initials RM, and the memory of this shop without once claiming it aloud. When Eliza finished, she folded the pages along their original creases, pressed the envelope flat with both palms, and set the tooth gauge across it so the curling paper would remain still. The letter described a marker behind the workshop, though Eliza had not noticed the sentence until the second reading. 3 stones east of the rear door, beneath the walnut nearest the creek. She put on her coat and stepped outside. Snow had crusted overnight. Using the ash shovel, she cleared the base of the tree and uncovered 1 fieldstone, then another. The third was smaller and nearly buried. Its upper face had been dressed smooth. When she brushed away the frozen soil, she found the same crossed paddle mark carved into it. Below the mark were 4 initials, E-W-A-W and W-R-A-W. Eliza knelt until cold passed through both knees. There was no grave beneath the stone. It was a maker's marker, set where the family could see the creek that had once powered their small machines. She placed her bare palm against the carving, then returned the soil carefully around its edges. Inside, she chose one of the old hand cards from the waxed bundle. The cherry wood had dried pale near the rim. Eliza warmed a spoonful of linseed oil beside the stove, mixed in half as much turpentine, and rubbed the liquid into the handle with linen. The grain darkened immediately. After 20 minutes, she wiped it until no shine remained. Then she lit the small whale oil lamp found on the upper shelf, using clean kerosene and a new cotton wick from Silas's store. Its flame stood low and steady beside the restored wood. That afternoon, kindnesses returned to her through ordinary objects. Silas had trusted her name with $15 of supplies and slipped an ash shovel beneath the counter. Amos had left dry maple beside the door, before asking whether she deserved it. Doris had tucked an apple into her pocket and later sent bread wrapped in cafe paper. Miriam had preserved one worn dollar in her desk drawer, as if a $4 deed could be treated with dignity. None of them had known about the tin box. Their gestures had been offered to the woman who arrived with soot on her cuffs and nowhere else to sleep. Perhaps you remember a kindness like that. Not the grand kind people describe at ceremonies, but a cup placed before you, a ride offered in rain, a debt given another week. Tell us in the comments about one small kindness you once received and never forgot. Someone reading may need to know that such things are still done. Before nightfall, Eliza carried the tin box to the workroom. She placed the money beneath the bench again, but kept the ledger, the letter, the hand cards, and Thomas Wren's medal beside her sleeping place. She wrapped them in Ruth's shawl and lay with one hand resting on the bundle while the lamp burned down. Cow Tra Loi, 5 Swap Part 5. The Slow Rebuild Section 5A. December. The roof. The first snow came on December 2nd, 6 inches laid evenly across the yard before dawn. Eliza read the roofing chapter in Silas's manual 3 times beside the stove, tracing each diagram until she could picture the order without looking. The workshop roof measured 48 feet long with 2 slopes of roughly 13 feet each. Allowing for overlap, waste, and the collapsed north section, she calculated that she needed 29 bundles of cedar shingles, 4 rolls of felt, and nearly 12 pounds of galvanized nails. The materials cost more than she could safely remove from the tin at once. She chose 3 silver dollars, recorded their dates in the ledger, and sold them to a coin dealer in Keene for enough to begin. Every remaining dollar stayed sealed beneath the bench. Silas delivered the shingles in his truck. Before leaving, he handed her a roofing hatchet with a square pole and a narrow gauge cut into the blade. "It belonged to my brother," he said. He had no patience, but a true eye. The following morning, Amos Pike arrived carrying a chalk reel and a carpenter's square. He had roofed barns for 37 years before arthritis bent 2 fingers on his left hand. When Eliza offered payment, he shook his head once. "You can pay me by listening." They worked for 11 days. They removed rotten shingles only as fast as they could cover the exposed deck. Where one rafter had split, Amos showed her how to sister, a sound length of spruce beside it, fastening the new timber beyond both ends of the fracture. Eliza snapped chalk lines across the felt and learned the 3-stroke method. 1 tap to start the nail, 1 firm blow to seat it, and 1 light stroke to leave the shingle unbruised. On the 4th day, Amos pointed with his hatchet. "That nail's proud." Eliza reached for the hammer. "Pull it." She did. Her fingers cracked in the cold. Snow slipped beneath her cuffs. Once, a shingle split after she had trimmed it perfectly, and she sat back on her heels, breathing through her teeth. Amos handed her another without comment. By December 14th, the last ridge shingles overlapped beneath a thin iron cap. Eliza climbed down after sunset and stood in the road while snow began again. The roofline was not elegant. One repaired section showed darker cedar than the rest, and the southern edge carried a slight old bow. It no longer opened to the sky. Section 5B. January. The chimney. January exposed what the first fire had hidden. 6 bricks near the chimney crown had begun spalling, their faces peeling away in reddish flakes. Mortar beneath them had turned to powder and spilled whenever the wind pressed against the stack. Eliza lowered the chimney brick by brick to the sound courses, numbering each salvageable piece in chalk. Silas sold her a sack of hydraulic lime and a small tub of fire clay. Amos advised a mortar of 3 parts washed sand to 1 part hydraulic lime for the exterior courses. Around the flue, Eliza mixed 1 part fire clay with 2 parts lime mortar, so the joints could endure repeated heat without becoming brittle. The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that rarely rose above 28 degrees Fahrenheit. She warmed the bricks beside the stove, carried them up 6 at a time, and laid only what could set before evening. Gloves made the joints clumsy, so she worked bare-handed, dipping her fingers into warm water every 15 minutes when numbness took away her grip. At night she tented the chimney base with canvas and left a covered bucket of hot stones beneath it to protect the fresh mortar from freezing. One course leaned. She removed it before it hardened. A second batch dried too quickly and cracked along the flue. She scraped it out and adjusted the water by half a cup. On January 27th, and after the final joints had cured, Eliza built a test fire with newspaper, pine, then maple. Amos watched from the doorway while the stove warmed. No smoke entered the room. Outside, a narrow gray column rose cleanly from the rebuilt crown and held together above the walnut branches. Section 5C. Late January. The floors. The floor revealed itself slowly beneath soot, lanolin, and a black skin of old varnish. Most planks were white pine, wide enough to show the marks of a hand plane near the walls. Several loose boards had been fixed with hand-cut rose-head nails, their irregular heads still tight after more than a century. Eliza lifted only the pieces softened by rot, replacing them with pine salvaged from an unused loft at Amos's barn. Silas rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. She began with 80 grit paper, moving with the grain and stopping whenever the old boards grew warm. The first pass removed grime and raised pale islands in the wood. A second pass at 120 grit softened the transitions. The final 220 grit pass left the surface smooth, without erasing every plane mark and scar. Dust entered everything. It lined her eyelashes, settled inside her boots, and turned the stove black to gray. She swept between every pass and used a damp cloth only after the floor had cooled. Then came 3 coats of oil. She warmed each small batch, spread it thin with folded linen, and wiped away the excess after 20 minutes. The boards cured for 48 hours between coats. With each application, the color changed from dark honey toward mahogany, though knots and nail heads remained nearly black. One morning she woke unable to begin. The sander stood ready. The repaired boards waited. Eliza carried her cup to the creek instead and watched a great blue heron stand among the shallows, its long body motionless while water moved around its legs. It waited nearly an hour before striking once and lifting away. Eliza did no work that day. The next morning she finished the final pass before breakfast. Section 5D. February. The windows. 8 windows remained in the workshop. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held panes split from corner to corner. The 8th contained 1 original sheet, wavy and faintly green, dated in pencil on the sash, 1788. Eliza removed that pane first, wrapped it in wool, and stored it flat beneath the counter until the frame was repaired. She cut replacement glass on the workbench, scoring each line once and snapping it over a wooden dowel. After setting the panes against thin beds of putty, she pressed glazing points into the sash with the side of a chisel. Silas showed her how to work DAP 33 glazing putty until it warmed in her palm. Eliza rolled it into narrow ropes, pressed them along the glass, then drew the putty knife in one deliberate stroke, keeping the bevel low enough to disappear behind the exterior muntin. The sash cords had rotted into brown threads. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot through the counterweight. The knot seated tightly without slipping into the weight pocket. When the first repaired sash rose and remained open, Eliza lowered it twice simply to hear the smooth movement. The original pane returned to the eastern window. Its rippled glass bent the creek and trees gently, preserving the imperfections made when it had first been drawn. On the final afternoon, Eliza pressed the last putty bevel beneath the north window. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch, close enough that she could see its claws close around the bark. The bird tipped its head toward the clean glass. Eliza held still until it flew. Xiao, LOI, Part 5. The Slow Rebuild Section. 5E. Late February. The plaster. The walls demanded a patience different from wood. Horsehair plaster remained between the hand-split oak lath, wherever rain had not reached it. Near the chimney, however, 3 patches failed in succession. The first mixture sagged because Eliza laid it too thick. The second dried chalky after she overheated the room. The third pulled away when the old lath flexed beneath her trowel. She scraped each failure back to a sound edge. Silas brought an old feed bag containing horsehair saved from his brother's upholstery work. Eliza washed it, cut it into short lengths, and folded it through lime plaster until the strands separated evenly. She pressed a scored scratch coat through the gaps in the lath, then added a 3/8-inch brown coat after the base had stiffened. That layer cured beneath damp cloth for 72 hours. The final coat was 1/8 inch thick, worked with a steel trowel until the surface held the quiet irregularity of the older walls. She stood beneath the repaired chimney and ran her palm across the cool plaster. These patches will hold another 100 years. Section 5F. Doris, Caleb, Reverend Boyd. Doris, from the spindle room, began leaving paper bags on the doorstep every Tuesday. She was a broad-shouldered woman with flour caught permanently in the crease of one gold wedding ring. The bags contained soup in sealed jars, heel ends of bread, bruised apples, and once a square of gingerbread wrapped in waxed paper. Whenever Eliza tried to pay, Doris pushed the coins back across the cafe counter. "In candles when the shop reopens," she said. Eliza did not tell her there was no reopening date. She began saving the straightest candle ends from the hardware store's damaged cartons. Caleb Pike arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle, balancing a splitting maul across the handlebars. He was 15, narrow as a fence rail, with a pale scar dividing one eyebrow. Without asking permission, he split the maple rounds Amos had left behind and stacked them beneath the southern eave with the bark facing outward. Eliza offered him $2. Caleb shook his head and looked toward the workshop sign. "My mother said, about your grandfather." Eliza did not correct the relation. She handed him bread and warm cider instead. He accepted both, then sharpened the maul before cycling home. Reverend Boyd walked past each morning at 7:15, a tall man whose black coat was always buttoned incorrectly by one hole. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat when Eliza was on the roof, when she carried ash, and when she knelt beside the frozen well. One morning, after seeing the rebuilt windows, He placed 2 fingers against the doorframe. "Keep her standing, Lord." Then he continued down the road. Section 5G. Cellar and Easter Egg. Eliza postponed the cellar until February 11th. The entrance lay beneath the trapdoor behind the workroom stove. 7 granite steps descended to a fieldstone floor 12 feet by 15, with a ceiling low enough that she had to bend beneath the summer beam. Water had entered along the eastern wall, leaving white mineral veins between the stones. At the center of the floor rested a dressed granite slab marked with the crossed carding paddles. Its edges were too exact to be natural, and iron rings had once been set into 2 corners, though only rust-dark holes remained. Eliza swept around it. She did not attempt to lift it. While clearing broken jars from beneath the stairs, she found a small oak box wedged behind the 3rd step. Its lid had swollen shut. She wrapped it in damp cloth beside the stove, waited until evening, and worked the seam open with the tooth lifter. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow had been shaped into 2 miniature carding paddles crossed at their handles. Beneath it was a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the workshop in a white blouse and dark skirt, holding a wire-setting hook against her apron. Her chin, wide-set eyes, and slight downward turn of the mouth were Eliza's own features, carried backward through time. Written on the reverse were the words, "Helen Wren, daughter of Elias Wren, age 25, summer of 1903. Eliza placed the photograph beside Ruth's shawl. The key remained on the mantel above the stove, where morning light touched it. She did not know what it opened. Section 5H. March and April. Spring. Snow retreated first from the south wall, exposing bent grass and 3 blue glass buttons beneath the eaves. The creek grew loud with meltwater. Walnut catkins lengthened above the roof, and damp earth replaced wood smoke as the strongest scent around the workshop. Eliza decided she would not begin making full carding combs that spring. The building was sound, but her hands still moved too quickly when a wire resisted. She chose 1 common silver quarter from the cache and exchanged it for maple scraps, practice wire, glue, and a small measure of linseed oil. Each morning she drilled sample rows, set 6 teeth, removed them, and began again. Some leaned, some split the wood, a few stood exact. The house was patient. So was she. Part 6. The Epilogue. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Eliza completed her first matched pair of wool cards. She had discarded 5 earlier paddles, 1 because the maple warped, 2 because the wire rows narrowed toward the handles, and 2 because the teeth caught and tore the test fleece. The finished pair was made from cherry wood, seasoned above the stove for 14 months. Each paddle held 24 rows of tempered wire, set from the outer edges inward. She tested them with 1 ounce of washed Romney wool, drawing it 3 times, without breaking the fibers. The handles received 2 thin coats of oil. Beneath one, she cut a small, crossed paddle mark. She placed the cards on the bench and waited until morning before calling them finished. The workshop had become warm without becoming new. White pine floors reflected the stove's low light. The repaired plaster preserved shallow trowel marks. Drawers held wire, teeth, handles, teasels, and linen in the order described by Margaret's letter. Ruth's shawl hung from a peg near the workbench, no longer used as bedding, but never enclosed behind glass. The brass key waited on the mantel until the following spring, when Caleb noticed a green stain on the older walnut beside the creek. He climbed onto a low branch and found an oval brass plate fixed to the trunk, where new bark had nearly grown over it. The crossed paddle symbol was stamped at its center. Eliza cleaned the narrow keyway with oil and a sewing needle, then inserted the key. It turned once. A fitted section of the plate released, revealing a hollow that had been lined with hammered copper before the tree closed around it. Inside rested a folded 48-star American flag, dry and dark blue, and a letter wrapped in waxed linen. The note was dated November 11, 1918. Helen Wren had written it after the armistice, while church bells sounded from Harrisville to Hancock. Her younger brother had survived the Meuse-Argonne fighting, but would return with damage to one lung. She asked that the flag remain in the living tree until a woman of the family found the key. "A country may announce peace in one morning," she had written, "but hands and households require longer. Keep the shop open to those who must earn their way back." Eliza folded the note along its weakened lines and returned it to the linen. The flag remained inside the workshop afterward, stored in an acid-free box Silas ordered without charging his usual markup. Thomas Wren's Purple Heart was honored on September 15, 2024, 80 years after the month of his death. Eliza carried it to the Harrisville Cemetery and placed it beside the Wren family marker during a quiet Sunday service. Reverend Boyd read Thomas's name, his unit, and the place in France where he had been killed. Amos removed his cap. Caleb stood with his bicycle against the stone wall. There were no speeches beyond that. Eliza returned the medal to its cracked case and kept it beside Helen's flag. She used only 4 coins from the hidden cash. 3 had paid for the first roof materials. The 4th purchased enough seasoned cherry wood and tempered wire to make 12 pairs of cards after her practice work was complete. Every use was written in Margaret's ledger, with the coin's denomination, date, sale value, and purpose. The remaining money was sealed in new oilcloth and returned to the false space behind the Teasel drawer. Eliza added a note in her own hand. For the next one, use what keeps the work alive. No sign announced the reopening. Doris placed an index card on the cafe corkboard between a notice for firewood and a photograph of a missing gray cat. Handset wool cards repair, fleece preparation, winter accounts. Available, ask for Eliza at Wren Comb Works. The first customer brought 2 paddles with loose teeth and paid in eggs. The second mailed a greasy fleece from Vermont. By February, Doris had begun keeping names in a school notebook behind the register. More than 40 people joined the mailing list, though the list consisted only of names, addresses, wool types, and whether they preferred written notices or telephone calls. Eliza accepted no more work than she could complete carefully. When young mothers arrived with raw fleece and little money, she opened the old ledger before quoting a price. Some names received a small pencil mark beside them. Winter account. Caleb returned one April morning carrying a sign wrapped in a horse blanket. He had grown several inches and could no longer ride the Schwinn without raising the seat awkwardly high. Wood shavings clung to his coat. With Amos's draw knife and a borrowed set of gouges, he had carved new letters from a piece of white pine salvaged during the roof repair. The sign read, "Wren Comb Works in Daughter Setting, Repair and Fleece." Preparation. Eliza traced the final line with one finger. "There were no daughters in the shop name," she said. "There are now. Only one." Caleb shrugged. "That is enough to start." They mounted it beneath the weathered original, preserving every surviving letter of the older board. The new pine looked pale against the silver clapboards, but rain and winter would alter it. Eliza did not stain the wood to make it appear older than it was. That evening, she cleared the space at the comb-setting bench and laid out cream writing paper. Her own letter began with the same words Margaret had used. "My dear one, whoever you are." Eliza wrote about Ruth's kitchen table, the green laundry basket, the $4, and the winter, when the roof stopped admitting snow. She included the mistakes. Glue overheated past usefulness, teeth driven too deep, plaster mixed badly, and the morning she could do nothing but watch a heron. She recorded where the ledger was kept, and why certain accounts carried no charge. She explained that inheritance did not require blood, only attention, and a willingness to leave the tools usable. Before folding the pages, she added instructions for the workshop as it now stood. Loosen the eastern sash each autumn. Oil the roof hatchet handle every February. Test the chimney after the first hard frost. And never force the teasel drawer when damp weather tightened the oak. What had been kept was still waiting for careful hands. She sealed the letter but did not hide it behind the cedar disc. Instead, she placed it in an empty drawer above the ledger, where the next worker might find it without proving anything first. Outside, April rain passed through the walnut branches and darkened the new sign. Eliza closed the shutters, banked the stove, and left one cleaned pair of handcards on the bench for morning. The wool carding comb workshop waits. It has always waited. In Keene, Miriam Bell retired at the end of that year. On her final afternoon, she emptied the shallow drawer beside her desk and found the worn dollar Eliza had paid across the counter 2 winters before. Miriam placed it inside the old green deed book, beside the entry bearing Ruth Morrow's name, and closed the cover over both. Script complete. Total approximately 4,800 characters. Kau tra Loi 7 Keech, Banda Huantat Olua Truok. Ket Thuk Dung Tai. Script complete. Total approximately 4,800 characters. Kong Kon Part Tiep Theo de Tiep Tuk. Kau tra Loi 8 Keech Ban Da Hoan. Tat Dai Duqua 6 Luot. Ket Thuk O Part 6. The Epilogue. Kong Ko Part 7 Trong Kau Truk Gok. Nen Kong Kon Noi Dung de Tiep Tuk.